Hello, I'm Gavin Rees and I manage the Dart Centre's programmes in Europe. The Dart Centre has been working now for more than 20 years as a think tank, resource base and networking centre for journalists and filmmakers who cover trauma and violence. And today I'd like to share with you some insight into handling the psychological pressures of working on the coronavirus pandemic. Now, the advice that I'm about to share with you comes mostly from the journalists in our network, but it's also backed up by recent research in trauma science. Now, journalists are very resilient. They're used to working on challenging stories. Working during this time, however, presents additional challenges. First of all, the traumatic news flow is unrelenting. That makes it harder to recuperate and to reset our stress levels back to baseline. And also, detaching from the story and building in a protective distance is more challenging when our families or ourselves could be affected by the virus. Then there's the fear of getting infected or infecting our sources, something many journalists in the field are struggling with right now. Not everybody's in the same situation, of course. Some journalists are working flat out on COVID stories. Others are wondering where the next assignment is going to come from. Now, people tend to think of resilience as a set quantity, something that people either have or don't have, but actually it's something that's always in dynamic balance. There's an overwhelming body of research that shows that one of the most important single factors in resilience is social connection. Now, that's being disrupted by coronavirus. So the question is, what might one do to put some extra ballast under that pillar of resilience? And one thing that some of the freelance journalists in our network have been doing is holding virtual editorial meetings with colleagues. They could be freelancers working on other stories, but just something that gives them the opportunity to share advice. We hear a lot about the importance of people reaching out when they're in trouble. It's also important to reach in. So if you're a journalist and you have concerns about a colleague, maybe make an extra effort to check in with them, find out how they're doing. So given how stressful working on COVID-19 stories are, it's important that you think about planning your time a little bit differently. When doing traumatic work, save the most emotionally challenging things you have to do. These could be difficult interviews, for example, at a time when you have the most energy, so that for most people, probably earlier in the day rather than later. When stress is unrelenting, it's very hard to concentrate. Probably most of us are working about 75% of normal capacity. Don't beat yourself up for not being able to do some kind of big task. Revise your goals and think about small steps that will give you a sense of attainable victory. And that's also true in your personal life. There's a lot of stuff on the news now about how this is the perfect time to take up a completely new hobby, learn Sanskrit or learn to juggle on a unicycle or whatever those things are. Now, they might be very kind of fun and distracting and could be useful in all kinds of ways, but try and limit the number of extra challenges that you place yourself under right at this particular moment. It's important to keep tabs on one's own emotional state. There's this theory that being strong is all about suppressing emotion and kind of stifling one's own feelings, but that's actually not good advice at all. In a situation like this, it's very common for people to be moving through kind of emotional bad weather, one moment feeling fine, the other minute feeling quite overwhelmed by things. And so checking in and taking stock of those changes is really important as a kind of mechanism for avoiding overload. The one thing I can't stress too much is the importance of finding ways of detaching from the news. Now, as a professional journalist, you'll need to know what's happening in the world. But it's really good to keep news exposure within a box, and that's because it's an occupational health hazard. The moment the news flow is unremittingly negative, you'll be receiving a much larger dosage of potentially distressing negative news than a member of the general public who'll be able to detach more easily. one useful way of thinking about traumatic news is to think of it as a kind of radiation. So journalists, just like nuclear workers, have a job to do, but there's only a certain amount of exposure before the badge turns black. So having an immersive hobby, chess, gardening, cooking, needlework, whatever it is, something that takes you away from the story. So take frequent breaks, and if you can, get up and move. When we're experiencing chronic stress, that translates into physical tension in the body. So muscular tension, people's breathing often becomes shallower. So it's really useful to have a series of techniques, or at least something that you can do to dampen down the physical bodily impact of stress. One thing that's very useful is deep diaphragmatic breathing. Just moving though, just getting out of the chair and moving around can be immensely helpful. Stretching those tight muscles, the tighter the body gets, also the kind of tighter the brain gets, or at least one's kind of headspace, the ability to think freely, contracts. So to end, I'd like to share two other things that come up all the time in our conversations in our network. The first is the importance of finding small positive things. So that could be an aspect of the story, it could be something to do with social connection with somebody one meets covering the story, it could be to do with nature, just simply delighting in the natural environment. Something that helps put ground and under one's feet and restore optimism. The second thing is the importance of taking a little bit of extra time to pause and remind oneself of why one's doing this job. There's nothing more important than professional validation and thinking about one's mission. This is a kind of major crisis, and the work that you as journalists and filmmakers are doing out there really matters. I hope you found some of this useful. We're hoping to do some more videos like this, and take care.